live stream. So anyone that comes to the event, if you're not able to attend physically in person for any reason, you can fully participate from the YouTube live stream. And we do monitor your questions and comments on YouTube and ask those to our presenters at our events. So myself, Thomas Logan, and Stacy Smith, who is in North Carolina, we will both be monitoring the YouTube live stream in addition to the questions on Zoom. So we, again, thank you all for joining. We want to give a special thank you to our captioner, Mirror by Night. Mirror by Night is works for White Coat Captioning and has been our captioner from the beginning of our events. And we are always very appreciative for the high quality captions that we get for our events. And you will never come to an Accessibility New York City event that does not have real-time captions. So we thank Mirror by Night. And then we also want to thank Jolie McPhee from the Internet Society of New York in the Accessibility Special Interest Group. Similarly, we always want our events to be broadcast and available online. We want good recordings of our events, and we want people to be able to participate if they can't physically join the event. So Jolie McPhee is who makes that happen for all of our events. And now I would like to hand over the presentation to our guest speaker tonight, Marcy Sutton. Marcy Sutton is a freelance web developer and accessibility specialist. She's worked at the head of learning at Gatsby and on the open source Axe Core accessibility testing library. For me personally, the Axe Core accessibility testing library is the best set of automated tools or automated checks for accessibility. So personally really honored and thankful to have Marcy here to speak with us today. Marcy is also the founding member of the Accessibility Seattle Foundation, which is a nonprofit supporting the Alley C meetup. So like how we have Alley New York City, Marcy has a meetup in Seattle with the same goals and objectives. And with that, I'd like to now hand it over to Marcy and have her teach us 5 things I learned from the accessibility community.
Hello, and thank you, Thomas. Super excited to be here. I'm going to share my screen now. All right, can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, let me get Zoom out of the way. Canonical problem, I'm sure people are familiar with. All right, so tonight I'm going to talk about some things that I've learned from the accessibility community over about 9 years or so of working in the industry. I've been a web developer for 11 years, getting paid for it at least. I was aspirationally a web developer before that, but I didn't know anything. And that first 2 years, I didn't know anything about accessibility. I mean, I'm sure I was putting click events on divs and not really knowing what lists or buttons were for in HTML. And so over the past 9 years, I've learned quite a few things. And so tonight I'm going to tell you some of those things. This is one person's perspective though. So if you have another perspective, you know, that's super valid. And we all make up this patchwork of passionate accessibility specialists around the world, and our experiences will vary. And that's a big theme that you'll find throughout all of this is I really try to pay attention to those other perspectives and really uplift and listen to other voices as well. But these are a few things that I've learned in the 9 years. You can find me on Twitter at Marcy Sutton. I'm also at Marcy Sutton on GitHub and Instagram. I share content periodically. But let's hear what else I've been up to. So a bit about my background. As Thomas mentioned, I worked on the Axe Core testing library for a while at DQ Systems. I worked on the open source JavaScript engine, the browser extensions, various other tools at DQ. So I got to see behind the curtain of an accessibility company, and I'll talk about that a little more later. I'm also a lead admin of the Web Accessibility Slack, and that is a community that has existed for 5 years now. And if you want to get into that group, it's currently invite only by email. Any member who's in there can invite someone. We locked it down a while ago to prevent abuse of open Slack communities. Currently exploring different options to make that easier to get into, but you can always tweet at me. I believe there's also a dedicated Twitter account now called @Ally Slack, A11Y Slack on Twitter. So you can DM or hit up that account if you're having trouble getting into the Slack group. There are some really great archives in there that you can search and ask a global community of passionate experts for help if you have questions. In the past, I've done some screencasting for egghead.io, teaching people how to code for accessibility. I have some new things coming out in the future working with Egghead. Most recently, I worked as the head of learning and then a lead developer advocate or lead developer relations engineer at Gatsby, which is an open source website generator. I have also been a part of the Accessibility Seattle meetup for a while. We are currently kind of figuring out our new normal with COVID as well. So without physical events, figuring out how to make things that work with all of our webinar fatigue that I think we've all been feeling. And so it's really great to see this group come together tonight with people around the world. I'm thrilled to be here with all of you. So what else am I into? Well, my big passion, aside from accessibility, is getting out into nature. And I have a photograph on the screen of a recent hike that I did where I baked a pie earlier in the week and found enough room in my backpack to cart along a slice of pie, and I ate it at sunrise. And so these are my two big passions in life, are accessibility and the outdoors. And photography plays a big role in that for me, in that I can go to these really remote places, have the physical exertion and energy to be able to get out there. There's some really inaccessible places that are hard to get to. And photography is a way for me to transport my friends and colleagues and people into these spaces that are not very accessible. And having a slice of pie just made it extra special. And it's kind of funny, I was going back through old photos on my new laptop, and I found a photo from a conference I spoke at in Switzerland called Uphill Conf. And I did a talk there called Empathy Driven Development. And that one was a really fitting conference since I love the mountains so much. But when I look at an image like this, I can think of things that I've learned since then. Like, I prefer to use the word compassion over the word empathy. Because when I'm talking about accessibility, I mean, empathy it's a good word. It's a good concept and a good thing to aim for. But I can't fully understand what someone's experience is like if I don't have the same perspectives, the same, abilities. So having compassion for someone's experience, to me, it resonates a bit more in that I can have a heart and feel for what they're going through, but I don't exactly know. So even I look back at things like this and I can think of how much I've learned, even from being there as an expert, speaking on a topic. So what I guess the first takeaway is just to know that we're continuously learning. People you consider experts are people too, and they're learning and growing, and myself included. So my biggest growth recently has been that I've struck out on my own as a freelance web developer. And as of yesterday, I have officially started my own business called Modern Soul Design. And you can consult with me to review designs for accessibility, do some UI prototyping and engineering, manual and automated testing. That's a bit of my specialty. Writing documentation, since I have all of that background as the head of learning at Gatsby. I do paid talks and break and learns for teams, as well as workshops and training and office hours for accessibility. So that's what I'm up to now. And if you have a need for that kind of thing, you can get in contact with me on my website. It's marcysutton.com. And on my contact page, I have a form. You can contact me there. So today we're going to talk about 5 things. I mean, I've learned definitely more than 5 things, but these are the things that are really coming to the surface for me in this moment. And that includes disability and accessibility communities, laws and guidelines, working in accessibility versus the mainstream, so some career development topics, in the practice of developing for accessibility, testing often for user impact, And then accessibility doesn't mean that a design has to be boring. So let's dive in. And why do I care about accessibility? What is it about accessibility? For me personally, it's that I care about people. Even if people are frustrating sometimes, infuriating, I care about them at the end of the day. I care about people's experience. And as technologists, we're in positions to remove barriers and make the web a more accessible place. And I don't know about you, but that gets me out of bed in the morning. It really makes me excited about work, and I love that they're within the whole range of roles in our industry. There's different ways that we can contribute to making the web more accessible to people with disabilities. Like that's huge for me. So hopefully, I'm guessing with this group, we probably have a lot of that in common. No matter whether you're a developer or a designer or QA, project manager, the whole gamut, we can all make an impact with accessibility, and that's what it's all about for me. Because in the US, 1 in 4 adults has some type of disability, and I've found some statistics from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention breaking down, the experience of people in the United States and globally. I mean, there's so many people who are affected by disabilities in all different forms, and so for the web, that's huge. I mean, that's more than IE8 or IE10 or whatever old browser versions you're expected to support. Accessibility is huge in how we can impact the designs that we put out there in front of people. If they're not accessible, that's leaving out a huge segment of people. So the disability spectrum, I mean, different ways that we can make a difference, including but not limited to the cognitive experience for someone with autism or a traumatic brain injury, learning disabilities, hearing with deafness, hearing loss, motor disabilities like spinal cord injuries, cerebral palsy, or ALS, for people with vision disabilities like low vision, blindness, color perception, and so many different experiences that people have, that it really is a spectrum. And so I try to really keep that in mind when I'm thinking about accessibility, is that to me it's about disability and people with disabilities. And that's really what I'm trying to make, who I'm trying to make it better for. There's the perspective that your life could change at any time. Like maybe you don't have a disability now or someone in your family doesn't, but that could change. You could lose an arm. You could have an arm injury. You could be a new parent and have a cup of coffee in one hand. The permanent versus situational disabilities. And I've long appreciated Microsoft's Inclusive Design Toolkit, which has some of these personas that you can use to talk about accessibility in different ways. But there's also the perspective that accessibility should be centered on people with disabilities. And that leads me to the first big thing that I've taken away or learned from the community, is that disability and accessibility communities are not always the same. Sometimes there's overlap depending on who you're talking to, or who's speaking, who's doing the work, who's using the website, but they're not always the same. And when this first really started to enter my consciousness was this tweet I saw from Matt May, who, fun fact, was my manager for a little while at Adobe. And he said, "Accessibility pro tip. If your timeline is not flooded with, quote, brand has a wheelchair tweets, you are following accessibility Twitter and not disability Twitter. Consider branching out. Or possibly your friends don't watch Game of Thrones, but that's way less likely." And I kind of went, oh, yeah, he's got a really good point there, that accessibility communities, are typically speaking about, technical things, design questions, the practice and the industry of making the web more accessible or technology more accessible. Whereas the disabled communities are talking about their experience, the barriers that people are facing, legislation that's being passed, or all the different types of topics that might come up.
How to upload a caption file to a video on.
We had a question and I didn't hear the whole question. Should I keep going?
I think keep going. I just muted just to Please put the questions in chat or on the
Okay.
YouTube chat if you have questions, and Mark's
Okay.
going to keep presenting.
And we
Thank you.
can, and well, yeah, we'll be happy to take questions a little bit later. That'll help me keep my momentum and consciousness going. Okay, so Matt Mays got this tweet. That got me thinking. So I expanded who I was following on Twitter, including people like Imani Barbarin, Crutches and Spice. And she has this great tweet that says, hashtag adapt the feed is about saying enough is enough. Disabled people saw how quickly the things we have been calling for were made available now that non-disabled people needed them, like remote work when COVID came around. She said, we want change now. You can commit to accessibility outside of a pandemic too, you know? And her feed has so many interesting insights about all kinds of things accessibility related. And on Adapt the Feed, she had further commentary saying, Adapt the Feed is for the disability community and anyone committed to disability representation and inclusion. And this really hit home for me. She said, disabled people find themselves adapting to an inaccessible society constantly. So now it's your turn to adapt your content and social media feed to not only accommodate disabled people, but elevate our voices and include us in your work. And Imani Barbarin's website is crutchesandspice.com. And so this concept of, if you're sharing things on Twitter or, really any social media, making sure you have alt text, making sure you're sharing videos with captions. And Twitter is often a place where we're sharing our work that we're doing elsewhere in the industry. So, sharing a website that you built or a talk that you did or really anything. So she's talking about the social media feed. I would take that as like that's the messaging channel for anything else that you're working on. So trying to make sure that content and those projects are accessible from the ground up and really elevating voices of people with disabilities in the process. And I also saw tweets from people like EJ Mason. They said, at one point, accessibility is so draining. I need to find rituals that help me de-stress and turn off my work brain. Trademark. I know, I'll order myself delivery. And then 5 minutes later, they say DoorDash says keyboard users can get effed, I guess. So they're, working hard, doing their job as an accessibility specialist, and then trying to get some respite later in the day and just hitting accessibility barriers. So there's a privilege for non-disabled workers in accessibility that you can sometimes turn that off. You can escape accessibility needs at the end of the day and use your mouse. There's a workout channel on YouTube that I've found that the teacher doesn't actually say out loud what the exercise is. So I have to be able to see the screen. And that's such a huge privilege that extra tiredness at the end of the day you aren't having to experience. And so this is why it's so important to really listen to what people with disabilities go through so that you understand what the stakes are for what we're trying to put out there on the web. Because accessibility is really about supporting disabled people first and foremost. Like you can't separate the two. You can't talk about accessibility or work toward accessibility and just focus on the technical challenges. Like it's not really what it's about. And so I always try to remember that and highlight that for folks so you know why we're doing it. Like, because that helps you get answers and know who to talk to get more information. And those nuggets of information you can get through user testing and, interviewing people who are impacted by the barriers they experience just adds so much more information and meaning that you can put into your work. And I love this quote from the Alliance for Inclusive Education that says, what disables people are the barriers that society creates for people with impairments. And as designers, developers, really anyone putting content and applications on the web or in, native as well, you might be the person creating that barrier without realizing it. So you are part of that society and that system that is oppressing disabled people. So mind blown for me to go, wow, I can actually make a difference there and I can tell people about it and then they can make a difference and we can make a difference for people with disabilities. And I really love that. So listen to more diverse perspectives, follow disability Twitter, the hashtag. There is so much great information about what people are going through. that really can give you that like oomph that you might need to go, okay, yeah, I'm gonna really knock this project out of the park for accessibility. There's also the A11Y hashtag, which is great. It's kind of a practitioner area, talking about websites and the practice of accessibility. It's super valuable as well. It's good to get all of the information you can if you're on Twitter. Disability Twitter is pretty great. So diversify your feed. That's the takeaway. Okay, so moving on, laws and guidelines. This was a big one for me because I came into accessibility for the, the passion and the heart of it and the curiosity. And the further I got into my career as an accessibility engineer, the more I learned about laws and guidelines. It's not that I really wanted to, like, I think I've sort of skated by not having to worry about that part as much. That's a bit of a privilege as well, in that, if you have a disability, the law is a tool that you can rely on to try and get have a space that's more accessible to you. You might need to really have the law in your pocket on that one. So it's important to know about laws and guidelines as accessibility practitioners. And for me, that really, even though I kind of ignored the guidelines and the laws at first, really the big impacting event for me was working on projects for Target. The case with them and the National Federation of the Blind, back in, I think it was 2009 is when they or decided 2006. And the Wikipedia page, Wikipedia is normally not where I go to for like, there's some historical information about the case and kind of like, what the NFB was, what they wrote to Target, what they were asking for. And there's some examples of like how that process went. And as an agency partner, everything that I made for Target had to be accessible. And that was my introduction to it. And this was a big case for accessibility. And they referenced, they were trying to get Target to optimize its website for the blind by adopting standards from the W3C, including the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So they pointed to those guidelines back then in 2006. And that's really the first I ever heard of it, was thanks to this law case. So the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 508 are a part of enforcing user civil rights in the United States. So these are the things that people have in their back pocket to lean on, because it has been legislated on. And so this is the part in the United States that we talk about with accessibility. And a lot of the guidelines around the world rely on some of the same guidelines that these point to, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. We'll talk about that more in a second. In the legal space, the person that I really respect the most and know about the most is Lainey Feingold. And she has a book called Structured Negotiation that I would highly recommend. She sort of cheekily describes herself as the attorney that doesn't sue people. So she has this structured negotiation process of working with organizations to come to an agreement about how to make an application or a website more accessible without litigating. And she puts out these legal updates every year. There's one from July, when the Americans with Disabilities Act turned 30 years old. So you can read about her legal update to learn about what's happening in the legal space. And this is something that I really grew to appreciate a lot in the last 5-6 years, I would say, of working in accessibility, was understanding the legal space. And Lainey is a really great person to follow. She's just been writing today or yesterday about some legislation being proposed about the ADA. So you can really keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening there by following Lainey and reading her book. So around the world, there's other global accessibility requirements, like Canada's Accessible Canada Act, the EU Accessibility Directive, various equality acts and bills in places around the world. And Lainey, again, has a blog post on her website that is updated periodically with all of the global accessibility requirements. but pretty much all of these that I've looked at reference the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, as I said. I've heard that it's like a trivia, or not a trivia question, but like a, how do you pronounce it? I call it WCAG. So it was a recommendation back in 2008, and it's really the standard for, the success criteria of how you make something accessible. And it's broken down into 4 parts: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And then within that, there are individual guidelines. There are different levels: level A, AA, and AAA. AA is usually the standard that people aim for, or companies aim for. AAA being like, if you can meet it, awesome, do it. And so WCAG I really grew to appreciate more over time as well, and that it's a sort of roadmap of how to codify some of these details of how to make things work for people with disabilities. And it's been evolved over time as well. There's the WCAG version 2.2, which is in a working draft and is, I think, will be published next year. So in between, we've had WCAG 2.1, that's the current standard. And so it's good to sort of keep an eye on what's happening. You can provide comment when things are in certain phases. Like I think WCAG 2.2, they had a comment period that may have just ended. And so that's a really great thing to keep on top of if you have time and you're interested. At the very least, referencing the most recent published version, which right now is WCAG 2.1, can be very helpful to know what do you have to incorporate into your practice as a web developer or accessibility specialist to keep things current. So about the WCAG versions, 2.0 was published back in 2008. 2.1 was published in 2018. How time has flown. It seems like just yesterday. And then 2.2 is scheduled to be published in 2021. And the W3C's Web Accessibility Initiative is always up to date. Like that's the place that I go to learn, the most up-to-date information about what's happening with WCAG. And you can go real deep and really detailed into WCAG for sure. And so I think for me, that's why maybe I just tried to work on like the mechanics of accessibility and sort of the practical, user-based scenarios. But as I got more professional with it and, more detailed really on the job, that's where WCAG becomes more and more relevant. And if you've used any testing tools recently, you might see little, breadcrumbs of WCAG popping up, because the usefulness of accessibility testing tools comes from the fact that they are really written to support WCAG. So on the screen, I have a screenshot of rover.com, the pet sitting website, and I ran the Accessibility Insights for Web Chrome extension on it from Microsoft that uses Xcore under the hood. And this site had a couple of color contrast issues. And this is what could be automatically detected, at least. And so like the search button's got a little red highlighter box on it to show me that that's what the tool has found. And then I've got an arrow pointing to the spot where it says WCAG 1.4.3. So the automated check is telling me which success criteria from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines it's referring to. So that's a great detail to pay attention to. Like what did it find? What is it referring to? Where do I go learn more information? Or is the result I'm looking at in Axe or whatever tool, is it even based in a WCAG success criteria, or is it a best practice or something that's kind of a nice to have if I fix it? So if I've got that little clue, that little detail of the success criteria number, I can go over to WCAG's understanding documentation and read more about what the requirements are, for example, for minimum contrast. So in a nutshell, you have to have enough of a ratio between your foreground and background colors. And that's written in detail here in WCAG 2.0. And I didn't mention it at the time, but with WCAG 2.1 and then 2.2, they are backwards compatible, and they contain everything that was in a prior version. So we're looking at contrast from WCAG 2.0 that's the same guideline that will be in 2.1 and in 2.2 and so on. So it's all encompassing. They were just adding on new success criteria for things like cognitive disabilities, mobile devices, and things like that. So if you're using automated tools, which are great, totally love them, totally use them all the time. However, there's some big gaps and they can't catch everything. And there's a famously awesome article from Manuel Matuzevich called Building the Most Inaccessible Site Possible with a Perfect Lighthouse Score. So Lighthouse being the auditing tool built into Google Chrome. It also uses Xcore under the hood. And his blog post successfully illustrates why automated testing is not enough at the moment. So there's a lot of things that you can accidentally let into your websites and web applications that current tooling will not catch. And a lot of people think they're fine. Like they see the 100% score on Lighthouse and they're like, all right, I'm done. But unfortunately, there's some big gaps that you could have missed. And so I love this blog post because it goes into detail of what some of those things are. So I would read that. And while you're at it, another one of my favorites is a blog post from Eric Bailey, who I think is here tonight. I saw him in the chat. His post on Smashing Magazine called The Importance of Manual Accessibility Testing is a longtime favorite of mine as well from 2018. I like Eric's gentle approach. Like he's frank, like he's not beating around the bush about the problems. But he's also kind of gentle about it because we want to win people over. Like I hear a lot about accessibility. It's like, it's too hard and I don't get why it's so hard. And there's all these differing opinions and all of that. And, you know, the more we can kind of like, I don't know, persuade people to like really dig in and understand trade-offs and, you know, be like, come on, it'll be okay. We can talk through, you know, these differing opinions. I think Eric's style is really great at accomplishing that. And manual accessibility testing is a huge part of the practice because automated tooling only goes so far. So I would highly recommend this blog post on Smashing from Eric Bailey because it'll further help you understand where the line is of what you can automate, what you need to test manually. Because manual testing is never going away. At least I don't think so. Okay, so working in accessibility or the mainstream. This is a good one, bit of career development. So this is definitely more of a personal experience kind of thing, but hopefully there's some nuggets of wisdom in here for all of you. So I get questions a lot of like, oh, should I go work at an accessibility company? Should I go, you know, like, what should I do with my career? So, and I've done a lot of various things. I went from mainstream into accessibility, back to the mainstream. Now I'm back in accessibility. So accessibility companies, in my experience, they're more specialized. So the products and services at an accessibility focused company like DQ or Pass Yellow Group, you know, those kinds of companies, like that's all they do. There's some really valuable internal knowledge there, like getting to see, you know, a mailing list or a Slack conversation from recognized, you know, awesome experts in the industry. Amazing, super valuable. You can see conversations of like, well, how would you, you know, they're trying to align on like how they would audit a certain feature or a certain web page to know like which success criteria does this meet or not. And like all of those discussions are so interesting. And that's hard to get anywhere else. I mean, maybe in the accessibility Slack, that's a good place where some of that stuff is discussed. But the professional level, like behind closed doors conversations are super valuable. There's usually company alignment on accessibility. Like you don't have to convince anyone of its importance. You know, that's not typically where you're meeting friction. I mean, I guess it's possible, hopefully not. But as opposed to mainstream companies, there's typically more alignment on accessibility being important. So here's an interesting one, and this will super vary, but in my experience, the roles at accessibility companies are potentially less competitive. So some of the technology might be old, My dog is now barking. So the roles, just like the tech stacks might be a little dated, you know, you might not have as much choice. The pay may vary pretty widely. Like there might not be a lot of data out there to know, like, you know, how much money can I make in this role? I guess on the other hand, you can potentially get a really competitive offer. And so that's sort of a, I don't know, a space you have to navigate when you're interviewing and hiring at a company. I've heard this one a lot. Subject matter experts feel their development skills atrophy or kind of like they suffer, whereas, you know, they're focused a lot on auditing and reviewing accessibility things, not so much on engineering. So if you're okay with that, awesome. If you're worried about that, maybe talk, you know, to your manager or, you know, hiring manager, find ways to keep those skills sharp if that's something that's important to you. And it's a really small world. So a lot of people in the accessibility industry have worked together. We know a lot of us know each other. We've got some baggage, we've got some dirt, we've got some drama. It's a really small world. So burning bridges is not so good. I don't know. It's kind of hard to avoid sometimes when you have disagreements or things just don't always work out. That's just part of it. So trying to conduct yourself professionally and I don't know, just know that people talk and we know each other and it's a pretty small world. It's a niche part of the industry. So in comparison, in the mainstream, you probably have wider reaching products and services. So websites that a lot of people use. I guess if you're a subject matter expert at an accessibility company, you might be consulting on some of those wider reaching products or services, but you might not be, you know, an owner of it necessarily. So like your relationship to the work is different. So if you're at a product company and you're working full time on something, you know, your goals are about that product, and that's what you're working on all the time. So it's worth asking if you're going to a mainstream company and you want to work on accessibility, what's the culture like there? Do they have internal specialists? Is there an accessibility team? Or is it like Twitter where they had all volunteers? It's going to vary. And that might change, you know, how supported you are. It could drastically change your experience in the mainstream. Like, are you a, you know, lone champion trying to like right a big ship? Like that's going to be hard to do. It's going to be hard to succeed if you're the only one. So it's worth asking, like, what's the landscape like for accessibility here? Am I the only person who cares? Might be kind of an uphill battle there. The company's size, type, and culture can really affect this as well. So, like if it's a tiny company, like a startup, if you are the lone accessibility person, maybe it could work out with the right group of people because you have like less bureaucracy and potentially less friction. If the people you're working with are like really open to learning and they're like, they pick it up, like it could work. But maybe not. I don't know. I've also, you know, struggled when I'm like, how do people not, like, I've been working here for a year. How are they still shipping accessibility anti-patterns? Like, it can be a little painful. You just got to keep on trucking because there might be less company alignment on accessibility, and that can be frustrating. And like any company, and this is true at accessibility companies too, that you're probably going to have to work through some friction. This is my most recent thing that I personally have been overcoming is working through friction. And you have a whole, you know, bag of techniques you might use depending on the person you're trying to persuade. They might respond to the carrot approach, you know, the like go talk to legal and make their life hard if they don't adopt accessibility. Or no, that's the stick. Sorry, I got it backwards. That's the stick to like poke and prod someone to do the right thing. Whereas the carrot's more of the like, hey, the cool kids are doing it. And you're kind of dangling the carrot to persuade someone that way. And so how you convince people to make change with accessibility can totally vary. when you have less company alignment on accessibility, what succeeds. You might need to try multiple things and go, find different techniques to get stuff to stick. So there's definite differences in working in accessibility versus in the mainstream. It's really all about, what do you want to do with your career? Like, what do you care about? Where do you want to go? What are your values? Like for me, I wanted to have an impact on more than one website at a time. I was working on, individual client sites. I was like, man, I really want to have more of a wider reaching impact. So I went to work on frameworks like Angular. I worked on accessibility testing tools, which got really specific and really niche. And then I opened it back up to the mainstream to have that bit broader impact again. So it might, what you want to do can evolve, but it's all about what you want to do to get to where you want to go in your career and what you value and the kinds of things that you want to work on. But no matter what, accessibility skills are highly employable, super competitive. Like if as a hiring manager, if I have two candidates and one has accessibility and the other one doesn't, guess who I would hire? The person with accessibility. And it's a very sought after skill. So highly employable. You can try different roles over time. So if you're doing the SME thing and you want to get back into engineering because you're just missing it, do your best to keep those skills sharp so that you can go back to it. But I've seen people go into management and then go back to individual contributor work. That's what I did. So you can try different things out. You're not stuck in the same pathway forever. But the further you get away from expertise, the harder you're going to have to work to get back. Make sure you're asking about salary ranges and levels when you're interviewing for something to know kind of like what the pay will be like. Talk to people who've worked at the company to see what's the dirt? Was it a good thing or not? Do work that you can believe in with people you trust. And maybe I'm a little naive or idealistic or something, but the more I've been in this industry, the more I care that I'm working with people I trust and doing work that I care about. So here's some bonus questions for you to steal. And if you're considering an accessibility role, who you're asking these to will kind of, change what exactly you're going to ask them, whether they're the hiring manager or a friend you've got who just happens to work at the company, whether they work there now or they used to. So here's a good one. How are accessibility impacting decisions made? If I have to recommend something for accessibility and I hit that friction, ultimately, who has final say? How does accessibility fit into your roadmap or your process? Is it just kind of oops, we forgot it, let's try and shoehorn it in at the end. You're going to be in for a world of pain. Or are they more proactive and, thinking about it earlier? How are disability representation and diversity at the company? Is there anyone with a disability that works here? Is the HR tooling completely inaccessible so that you have a harder time hiring someone with a disability? Those are good questions to ask up front. On the personal kind of development direction, what's the path to promotion like for this role? Are there performance reviews? Is there even a track for me to go forward? I didn't even think to ask that up front at some of my jobs, and some of them you maybe don't progress as much as you would like. Great questions to ask if you have a friend that works there, or you get a hold of an acquaintance or somebody, and you can ask what they like about working there, what their least favorite part is, what kind of friction they encounter in their job. You can potentially sniff out some of the issues that can change whether or not you want to work there up front by asking good questions and really paying attention to what people answer. All right, so cruising through the rest, I do want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to try and get the move on here. So number 4, testing often for user impact. And the real purpose of this is to remove barriers iteratively, all the time. So we're not shipping them without realizing it. And we do this by making accessibility part of our web design and development workflow. and making it part of your definition of done. Like, get project managers on board. This is really the ideal, is to try and chip away at it all the time, and not this like, we'll add mobile in phase 2, we'll add accessibility in phase 3. That is a huge red flag if you ever hear of those. I mean, the best place to be doing this is, I have a screenshot from GitHub on the forum project, which is dev.to's, like their community platform. When you open a pull request, they have some prompts for things like, did you add tests? Have you added to the documentation? You could add a line here that says, has it been tested for accessibility? To prompt someone who's submitting the pull request, I'd like, this is the smally scoped, opportunity to try and implement accessibility, with each feature, with each shipment. So as you're doing this, you can support users by starting with accessibility basics, like those always apply, form labels and image alt text and all those things, using browser extensions and testing tools, zooming in and out and magnifying your layouts periodically to see if they break, or if you can even zoom at all, testing with assistive technology, baking accessibility into automated tests, and then actually testing accessibility use cases. Like, do you have some alt text interface that no one actually uses and it's like awful? Testing those so that they aren't just like this product graveyard of failed experiments. You can really support users by making these things part of your regular workflow. I'd highly recommend taking the no mouse challenge. So turning your mouse off or unplugging it, or something one day a week or more. And related to this, I wrote a sort of a joke, but sort of not, package called No Mouse Days. I was like, what if we just turn the mouse cursor off for everyone? That would do it. So you can play around with that package. It's on GitHub and on NPM if you want to take the no mouse challenge and put it into your application for other people. Maybe not in production, but for your colleagues. And testing with screen readers. This is one that would really help. Testing with, on Windows with NVDA and Firefox, on mobile devices like iOS and Android, and, with VoiceOver on OS X. And WebAIM has some great articles on screen reader testing. Of course, a caveat is that if you're not a daily screen reader user, you might not even know what you're looking at or what you're hearing. So hire people with disabilities to join your team. Like, that disability representation can be huge to getting perspectives surfaced earlier. You can also work with groups like Fable and AccessWorks, potentially groups local to your area, to get that input regularly about your designs, your prototypes, your features. Get that input all the time, and I would highly recommend doing that. And remember that you're not the user. Like, maybe in some small use cases for like your own side projects or something, but we're not the user. Like, you just don't have the same perspective that users really will when they're not as familiar with the design. They don't, you're just not, you don't have that bias. And so that lack of representation of diverse users and user groups leads to a lot of assumptions about what's safe or intuitive that are not correct. So we got to remember that and get some usability and accessibility testing with real users with disabilities. Okay, so our last thing before we break and have some questions, time permitting, is that accessible doesn't mean boring, but simpler is often better for a lot of reasons. One of my favorites of like a beautiful, gorgeous, fresh website is the recent accessibility project redesign. I wrote about it on my blog called Accessibility Wins, where I really try to highlight what's working, like what's good, what's awesomely designed, what's innovative. So if you've worked on something that you're proud of, that you think is, innovative and fresh and cutting edge and all of that, send it to me, because I am dusting my blog back off and starting to write again, because I think we need to celebrate the wins more. I know it's kind of fun to look at the fails, but I think the wins are important too, especially since there aren't that many, especially in this, I don't know, cutting edge design category. They do exist though, and it is possible. And a big part of this that's followed me throughout my career is this idea of simplicity being intuitive, and that making users think, like assuming that somebody's going to hover or focus on something to like get a visual label of what it means, like removing those steps can make it a streamlined, easier to use interface. And I think that's super powerful. So Steve Krug's book, Don't Make Me Think, was super pivotal in my practice of becoming a web developer. So I'd highly recommend that, even if it's got some dated screenshots in it, the concepts still apply. And here's an example of some icons that maybe aren't as obvious to everyone. So there's 4 icons on the screen. I mean, maybe depending on how old you are, you might have a guess of what they are. But I think of apps like some of the apps from Google, sometimes like it's really hard to tell what the icons are for. And without visual labels, it's hard to know that they mean save, home, menu, or stats. I mean, some of these are a bit conventional in like the menu, hamburger menu. But who knows? I mean, there's an assumption right there. Like, is it obvious or not? Here's one that I found this week in Instagram that's been really bugging me, of the alt text interface on iOS on Instagram. If you have more than really more than one photo and you go to add alt text, they don't show the image next to the text area that you have to fill in. So you have to use your cognitive abilities to remember what photo was in what order. I can never remember. It also, the keyboard covers part of the interface when you're trying to use it. So I talked a minute ago about the product graveyard of failed experiments. Sorry, Instagram, but it's like, is anyone using this? Because it's painfully hard to use. And the cognitive part to me is like that, having to remember 10 images in a row to be able to fill in the alt text. It's just really hard to use. So testing it early and often, getting it in front of people to get their feedback, like that would all have applied here. And then that cognitive complexity, like put the image next to the field, make it easier to remember. So there's established UI patterns that you can follow. Like if you're really wanting to innovate, make sure you look there first at the ARIA practices guide. They are not production ready. But you can at least look through the mechanics and the navigation conventions for how a lot of patterns work. And you can use that as your starting point. So I would recommend that. I'd also recommend prototyping designs with code for accessibility, or, prototyping with code, I think, is superior to prototyping tools. It's my own opinion and my own bias, and that's because a lot of prototyping tools maybe don't have accessibility built into them. With code, you can really get fine-grained about how these mechanics should work for the keyboard and screen readers. And prototyping up front can save costs long-term because you've already validated, is this going to be accessible? We did a lightweight prototype, and yes, it will work. And you can even test those with groups like Fable. So prototyping is awesome. And as you're doing that, consider input modalities in your software architecture when you build the real thing, so that you're not like backing yourself into a corner. I think of back when we used jQuery and everything was event driven. Like I click this, this function gets called and I do this thing. If you do more of like a not necessarily using the React framework, but the way that React is more programmatic state changes, if you architect your websites and applications to be more like responding to state instead of user input events specifically, you can sort of like trigger those user input events, but it makes it a lot easier to support things like pointer devices, keyboards, touch, speech, waving your arm with a motion gesture, or even changes in ambient light. And who knows what else will come up. So if you kind of think ahead of time and how you architect your app to consider different input modalities, it's a good way to go. Save yourself from some technical debt. And really all of this, like this whole, 9 years of experience that I've sort of distilled here for 2020, it's all about user experience. Like accessibility is about user experience. They're not separate. So we can all make it better, and we're all in positions to have our own little sphere of influence, and our impact. And so I'm thrilled to have gotten to share all of this with you, because I feel like I'm in good company here with people who care as well. So let's make it better. We really have potential to make the web more accessible as we learn more and we share with our friends and colleagues. So yeah, that's what it's about. I've got some resources here, and I need to wrangle Git a little bit, but I'll try and get these slides up tonight. I've got some resources on my website, like books, testing tools, various learning resources and things. I have a Smashing Magazine accessibility workshop coming up in November. It's on Fridays and Saturdays. It's like 2 hours each day over 5 days over like a couple of weeks. So you can check that out. If you're more on the design side of things, because I do sort of kind of come from design to development and back again, I'd highly recommend WebAIM's Accessibility for Web Designers. Speaking of different input modalities and different ways of interacting beyond desktop, I love BBC's Mobile Accessibility Guidelines. I talked a little bit about working with Fable and prototyping. I wrote up some research on accessible client-side routing when I was at Gatsby, and then the link to my Accessibility Wins Tumblr. So yeah, I'll try and put these up on the web, but that's it. So thank you so much to everyone at Accessibility New York and around the world. I wish I could be in New York. That would be pretty awesome. But yeah, with the power of the internet, we've come together. So yeah, if we've got time for some questions.
Thank you so much, Marcy. This was amazing. And hello to everybody. My name is Stacy. I'm one of the co-hosts for tonight's meetup. So yeah, we've moved into the Q&A portion. So if you have any questions for Marcy, you can speak up over your microphone, or you can type it into the Zoom chat. And for those of you who are watching on our YouTube channel, you can also type questions in over there. I'm watching you over there, and we'll happily bring it back to the Zoom. So without further ado, go ahead and fire off, everybody. I know one of the first questions that already came up, people are interested, Marcy, in your slides from tonight, and if we will be able to make those available.
Yes, I will tweet them a little bit later. So I just got a new laptop and Git was not playing along. So I will, I'll push them up and share a link on my Twitter, which is @MarcySutton.
Okay, excellent. So from Ryan, we have, what is the biggest takeaway that you have found in usability testing with disabled participants?
The biggest takeaway I had was that even after working in accessibility and coming into it, like with all of the knowledge that I had, I still had biases and gaps. Like that was the biggest thing. And I loved working with Fable, and there's other groups as well. It's really teaching you how to work more than like the specific thing you're solving. Like, I think that was a bigger, broader takeaway. Like I was trying to get answers about client-side routing, but I learned so much more about usability testing. And I think that's a really valuable exercise for teams to learn how, what is it like when someone with a disability tries to use my app or, this feature that we're trying to put out, like getting that feedback is amazing. So I would highly recommend it.
Excellent. Okay. From Aurelia, she has a question regarding your previous points about HR and hiring, specifically about government agencies. She's wondering how you would tell or show a hiring manager that you have an accessibility skill, if you want to be broadcasting that or using that as part of your sort of skill set when you're trying to get a job.
Ooh, yeah. So I guess my caveat is that I have not actually worked for government agencies directly. But I think for any job, finding ways to tell your story is super valuable. So where it can be hard is if you can't show your work, like, you don't have clearance or permission or something. Maybe try to find a way to like recreate that in a code pen, or like find some way to represent the higher takeaways of what you learned from that thing. But having ways to tell that story, it'll vary depending on what you need to show, but having a GitHub, a portfolio, some sort of like people have to see your work somehow. So finding the best way to represent that. I think having some projects listed that you've worked on, and that those give good talking points for them to ask you about. So like, hey, tell me about this project you worked on, and maybe think ahead of time of what your biggest takeaways were, things you learned, so that you're already armed and ready to answer. You can even lead with some of that stuff if given the opportunity. Hopefully that answers the question.
I think so. I think that's great. Let's see. We have another question. Is the IAAP certification appropriate for that question in terms of, I'm guessing if that's a useful certification for people that are wanting to be able to display their accessibility capabilities as part of the HR process. What are your
Yes.
thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Yes. So the IAAP certification, I would recommend it. I didn't personally go that route. I was already pretty far into my career. And so I just didn't feel a need personally, but I've heard really great things from friends and colleagues that have gone through that, and that the practice of studying for it and going through it, you learn so much. So like the exercise of doing that, getting that certification has a lot of value. And then having that certification at the end, I think both of those things can really serve you in your career. So I would recommend it.
Excellent. So we have a question from Christina. What should we expect with the emerging technologies of AR, VR, MR in terms of accessibility? Can we somehow get ready, familiarize ourselves?
Ooh, good question. So I guess, well, the first thing that comes to mind for me is that there's always going to be emerging technology. And so that's a really great way to market yourself. Like keep it like your finger on the pulse of like what's coming. And if there's something in there that you're particularly interested in for whatever reason, like you have a passion for gaming, or whatever your connection is, like find something that just has that extra level of interest for you, and try to find who's doing the research. Like for me, early on, it was web components, and there wasn't any information about accessibility and web components. So I just started testing it and interviewing. I think I interviewed Marco Zia, who worked at Mozilla. I think he still might. But I found whoever I could who knew something about it because they worked in the domain, and try to create that information if it doesn't already exist. So I think, yeah, it's like you can't be an expert in everything. So finding what is most interesting to you, and then not shying away if there isn't much information out there. Like you might have to create that information. And the best tip I got at some point when I was like, why am I not getting any answers? My friend was like, that's the hard part about being at the top of the food chain or being the first, is that info might not exist yet. And especially with emerging technologies. So that's actually an opportunity to set yourself apart as being like, hey, I was really curious about this thing and I did all this research on it. Like, how does the keyboard work with it? Or, whatever aspect of accessibility you want to dive into. That is a really cool technique to learn more and market yourself as a technologist. So Twitter might be a good place to look. Find people who are talking about it and interview them. Like, just start like pulling at threads,
Very good. From Margie, we have, when figuring out how to remediate accessibility bugs, what are tips for convincing product leadership to include this work into product roadmaps?
Good question. I mean, so I talked a little bit earlier about like working through friction with carrots and sticks. So what people respond to is like, what actually succeeds is going to depend a lot on like who you have to persuade. Are people more sympathetic to it, or they like, do they respond more to like hard numbers? Sometimes talking to legal might help, or taking a finance angle of like lost income from people with disabilities as customers. So it's all about finding the best way to persuade whatever stakeholders you need to convince. Like, what do they respond well to? What's worked in the past? Because there's no one right silver bullet to do it, unfortunately. But making it compelling, like trying to provide estimates up front of how long you think things are going to take, give people easy wins, like quick wins that you can celebrate and be like, hey, look, we really made some progress here. Like that might kind of give you some leverage to do bigger efforts. Just make it really hard for people to say no. And I found being less adversarial as worked for me. It's something about persuading people. I don't know if there's like a gendered part of that might be like, as a woman in tech, like I have to kind of like change how I like my tone, and that's an unfortunate reality, at least in my own experience. And it's all about trying to find those like how to be persuasive. So it'll vary, but I think the takeaways I would say are like give people quick wins and come with solutions and estimates.
Great. So from Jacqueline Ong, she had a question. How would you go about suggesting accessibility recommendations to websites and apps for bigger firms?
Can you repeat that one? I think my
Sure.
energy just
How would
dipped.
you go about suggesting accessibility recommendations to websites or app companies or bigger firms?
So that sounds big. I think I was just like, whoa, that's like a really big topic. Like that sounds like whole programs potentially. Like if there isn't anything in place, I mean, that's like a pretty big topic to try and like get a whole program spun up in place. Yeah, I think it'll probably depend on like which part of the market it is, like what type of a product or service is it, like sort of back in the persuasion angle, like who are the customers, and like what kind of customers are you missing out on by not including accessibility. Yeah, I guess depending on how deep you want to go and how much time you have, maybe interview some people, get some user feedback. Like if it's a big company, they probably have some, like a feedback channel or even feedback to customer service team. Maybe interviewing them and seeing like, hey, do you ever get accessibility feedback? Like there might already be some feedback that you could use as leverage to take to the stakeholders and say like, hey, people are already having a problem with this. So that's probably where I would start, is like go befriend the customer service folks and see if they've heard anything. And I think my approach now is like pulling at threads. Like, okay, I got a little like clue over here. I'm going to go see if I can find out anything. And hopefully that's not a free time endeavor. Kind of goes back to my point about like, if you're interviewing for a company, are you going to be the only person that cares? Or is there a team of people? Is this a volunteer effort that you're not getting compensated for? Like that could be kind of exhausting when you're just trying to make the web a better place. So yeah. It's a big topic. Hopefully I answered that somehow.
No, I think it's great. I think we have time for one or two more questions. We had a question saying that you've been a leader in highlighting accessibility wins. What is your favorite one or two accessibility wins?
Ooh, well, definitely the accessibility project. Yeah, I sort of just dusted this project off. I got pretty burned out the last couple of years, and I think I launched this in like 2014, so it's been a while. So the fact that it's still alive at all, I think is a pretty good win. Some of the recent ones, just looking at the site, Adobe's Spectrum CSS library, I think is really awesome. And I sort of like I want more user interfaces to show. There's always more tools to talk about, things like accessibility insights, but what I'm really yearning for is more interfaces. And I was pleasantly surprised when I looked at Google Maps. Their interface I thought was pretty cool. I did test it and then saw it regress, and then I think they fixed it again. But seeing like modern web applications that they have solved some hard problems.
Yeah, we had a comment about in the Zoom chat about Google Maps specifically, that they had limited accessibility toggles. So do you have any comment on that, or did you experience the same thing?
Well, I'd have to ask whether it was the app or the API. So when you embed a Google map, like that's different. The thing I was writing about was like when you go to maps.google.com and it's like the full web application in the browser. That one had good accessibility built in. But I wrote about it, gosh, it had to have been, yeah, it was a year ago. So there's always that caveat. Like I already saw it regress once and like it got worse and maybe it got better. So like sometimes that's the hard part about wins even is like, it might be awesome at that moment in time and then it can regress. But when I did review it, it had great keyboard accessibility and yeah, it was like actually usable. But yeah, I'd have to see more about the limited accessibility toggles. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, hopefully accessibility is just, built in for everyone and it's not something you have to toggle on and off. That's really what we want to aim for is like a streamlined, inclusive design that just works.
Excellent. Any more questions before we wrap up with Marcy tonight? Last call here and also on YouTube. Let us know. If not,
I see one comment from John Croston that said, "What about making things accessible as you go and ask for forgiveness later?" Yes, I am a big proponent of that. I sort of just would do that. Like I'd be working on a Target thing, and then I'd switch over to Nintendo, where like accessibility wasn't part of the requirement. But I'm like, well, I'm not gonna like not make it as accessible as I can as I'm working on it. And you just do it. So yeah, I'm a big fan of that, but you also need to get compensated for your time. And so like staying late to do it is not ideal, even though I did it anyway.
Cool. Okay. Well, let's see. I'm seeing 2 more messages. Lots of thanks and praise, of course. Yeah, this has been really awesome. What kind of pie did you have in that photo? That's a question that we've got.
It was mixed berry with blackberries that I foraged from around town. And then it was kind of the last harvest of my raspberry plant. So mixed berry is my all-time favorite.
That sounds amazing.
Like, oh, summer's over.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Marcy. This has been amazing. We will, we'll work together to get the slides from tonight posted after tonight's meetup, and we'll most likely share them on our meetup page. So those of you who joined this through there, look to that site for the presentation. I'm seeing something on YouTube. Yeah, just more thanks and praise and happy faces and all of that good stuff. So thank you all for joining us. I want to thank our sponsors tonight, Equal Entry, Julie McPhee from the Internet Society of New York, who is doing the live stream for us, and also Mirror by Night from White Coat Captioning, who did a wonderful job doing our captions for this evening. And thank you all from all over the world in all time zones. Please stay in touch and keep safe out there. We'll be in touch about upcoming meetups and hope to support you all and all of your accessibility efforts wherever you are. So be in touch and be well. So thank you, everybody. Thanks, Marcy.
Thank you, Marcy. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.